Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Mention the Identity Salon as one of the other things that I do. It's fun. It brings in senior identity architects and industry leaders to talk about the big problems they're seeing. And we had a salon meeting recently. One of the things I found myself dwelling on was the word discovery. I mean, it came up when we were talking about accounts. It came up when we were talking about AI. It came up when we were just talking about information. How do you find all the things? That's a lot of discovery going on. And it made me realize that I'd been treating that word as if it belonged to, whichever problem space I happened to be standing in at the time. I mean, when I lived more fully in the world of research and education federation, discovery usually meant helping an end user find their identity provider. The user wanted access to a service, the service needed to know where to send them to authenticate, and the discovery process helped them get there from here. Now, in scholarly publishing, if you say the word discovery, they're immediately going to go to something completely different. It means helping the reader get to the content that they might be looking for. Same word, different problem. Or at least that's how I'd really been thinking about it. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized I've been thinking about discovery inside localized problem spaces like federation discovery, content discovery, account discovery, credential discovery, agent discovery. Each area has its own vocabulary, assumptions, tooling, and governance models, which makes sense, right? People solve the problem in front of them. Of course they do. The right answer depends on what you're trying to find. Mostly. The part I needed to remember is that it's not actually just about me. It's not even about the groups I work with or the systems we're trying to make easier to find, navigate, or trust. Discovery is, in its own way, a much broader classification of problem. People are trying to find and track information that's scattered across so many different types of things, different accounts, platforms, protocols, wallets, inboxes, systems they may not even remember using. So the localized problems are very real, but they are pieces of a much larger pattern. The whole internet is a discovery problem. And it's not because internet search is broken. Search still works well for many things. If the information is public, indexed, reasonably well described, and close enough to the words you know to use, search remains astonishingly useful. So I'm not here to complain that search engines no longer work, because they sometimes insist on showing me 12 product roundups, 3 Reddit threads, and a very suspiciously cheerful AI summary before I get to the thing I actually wanted. For the record, I'm not actually delighted about AI summaries, but I digress. The problem is that search is only one form of discovery, and many of the things we now need to discover do not behave like web pages. They may be private accounts, they may be credentials and wallets, they may be identity providers or claims or institutional relationships or software endpoints, they may be AI agents. They may be pieces of information buried in Slack or Discord or Teams or a customer portal. I mean, there's so many different places that the information you're looking for could exist, and search narrows that down when the thing can be searched. But that's a really narrow condition. So one reason discovery feels harder is kind of obvious. There's simply too much information. That's one of the reasons you have these silos of, well, yes, search will look at web pages and grep will look at files on a Unix operating system. I think that the statement that there's simply too much information is it's a statement that's so familiar it's almost meaningless. I mean, information overload sounds like one of those problems that everyone recognizes and promptly ignores, because the answer is supposed to be something like, well, just manage your inbox better, or just turn off notifications, which great advice as far as it goes, but it's not exactly a structural solution. I did some research as I generally do before I wrote this blog post, and one of the things I found was a systemic review of strategies for managing information overload, which defines the problem of information overload as cognitive strain caused when the amount of information exceeds a person's ability to process it. Now, this review found that responses to overload fell in several categories. There were personal strategies such as filtering and avoidance, organizational and technical solutions such as dashboards and recommender systems, Educational approaches such as information literacy and communication changes such as simplifying what gets shared and how. The point is that not any one of these things actually solves the problem. The point is that overload is both a human problem and a systems problem. And that matters for discovery because we often talk as if finding information is only a matter of giving people better tools. If only we had better search, or better filters, or better tags, or better folders, or better bookmarks, better AI. Really, just be organized and all your discovery problems will go away. Sure. And while we're at it, let's all maintain perfect filing systems, read every saved article, clean up every old account, and never again leave 47 browser tabs open because one of them might contain something important. All of these tools and habits can help, but none of them change the basic problem that more information creates more burden unless the system also helps people understand what exists, what matters, what is current, what is authoritative, and what they can safely ignore. And that's where the discovery problem starts to separate itself from the search problem, right? Search asks, can I find something that matches this query? Discovery asks much more complicated set of questions. What exists? Where is it? Who controls it? Is it the right thing? Is it still valid? Is it trustworthy? Why was this result shown instead of another? What is missing? What should remain hidden? That last question I want to dwell on for a little bit, right? A good discovery system is not always one that makes everything easy to find. Sometimes the right answer is something that should be findable only by the right party, under the right conditions, and for the right purpose. This is already true in identity systems. It's also true in personal data, enterprise systems, digital estate planning, AI agent ecosystems. Discovery is not a purely technical challenge. But before we go there, it is worth sitting with the more basic issue that people are trying to manage more information than their own habits can reasonably support. And one of the more relatable responses to information overload is to save everything, right? You bookmark it or you download it, you put it in a folder, you leave the browser tab open, you somehow try and preserve the trail. And I say this with great affection because for my own, I might need this someday systems, several of which are best understood as private archaeological sites. If only you could see my Evernote collection. Now, saving information is useful and necessary, but it's also a way of just relocating the discovery problem from the public internet into your own, probably badly indexed digital attic. Now, research on information hoarding, which is a thing, is useful here because it complicates the comforting idea that saving more is always better. There was one study that described information hoarding as a continuously saving and accumulating digital information while having difficulty deleting it. The authors connected this behavior to information overload, selective exposure, and identity bubble reinforcement using an information ecology model that treats information, the information environment, and the person processing the information as interacting parts of the same system. I mean, that's just one study based on a specific population, so I wouldn't treat it as like the universal law of human behavior, but it gives useful language for something that many of us recognize that saving more does not automatically mean understanding more. The problem is not only that there is too much information out there, there's also too much information in here, in our saved folders and inboxes and note apps, all this mental list of things we're going to get to someday. And someday being a very, very large time horizon. So that same study found that information hoarding was positively related to selective exposure with information overload acting as one mediator, which in plainer terms means accumulating more information may not make us more open or better informed. It may increase the burden of filtering and make us more likely to return the familiar, the confirmatory, the things we've already saved, which makes you stop and think for a minute, right? A personal archive is not the same as a discovery system. A password manager is not the same thing as a complete account inventory. Your bookmarks folder is not the same as knowledge management. Saving can preserve information, but it doesn't necessarily make that information findable, usable, or trustworthy later. And when people face too much information, they filter. Of course they do. Filtering is not a moral failure. It's a survival mechanism when you're being flooded with too much stuff. The question sort of becomes what kind of filtering happens and who controls it? Some filtering is intentional. We choose sources we trust, we unsubscribe, we ignore certain topics, we skim. Some filtering is infrastructural. Platforms rank what we see, search engines decide what appears first, recommendation systems infer what might keep us engaged, right? Paywalls will determine what we can access. There's a whole lot going on here. Enterprise systems will hide information behind permissions. Even standards groups and vendors and governments and publishers, they all create platforms that have different visibility rules. None of that filtering is neutral, even when it's useful. And some of the filtering is psychological. Under overload, people naturally reduce effort. They rely on familiar sources, familiar frames, familiar communities, and familiar interpretations. The information hoarding study explicitly connects overload with selective exposure and discusses how individuals may process information in ways that reduce complexity, including focusing on information that more closely aligns with their interests, needs, or cognitive bias. So, just filter better is obviously kind of a weak answer when you're looking at that. Filtering is unavoidable, but filtering is also where discovery starts to become governance because you get to decide who's deciding what is visible, who decides what's recommended, who decides what's hidden or who benefits from the rankings, who can tell whether the result was selected because it was authoritative, popular, sponsored, personalized, recent, or merely really good at playing the ranking game. None of these questions are actually new, right? Librarians and archivists and publishers, search engineers, we've all been dealing with versions of this problems for years, sometimes even for centuries. Sometimes it just feels like centuries. What feels different now is how many domains are being forced to deal with this kind of problem all at one time, which is where generative AI actually enters the story, right? People are not turning to AI intermediaries only because they are dazzled by the technology. I mean, some are, certainly. There's no shortage of novelty chasing in this industry. And apparently, we must all spend some portion of our lives pretending that every chatbot is either the end of civilization or the start of a productivity utopia. But there's a more practical reason people reach for AI, right? It reduces the apparent effort of discovery. Instead of constructing the right search query or opening 10 tabs, a user can just ask a question in plain language and get a synthesized answer. That's so deeply appealing. It turns discovery into a conversation, and that appeal becomes even stronger under information overload. A recent study of generative AI chatbots in e commerce looked at how human like features affect users' willingness to adopt NI as a decision aid. Now, the study was specific to online shopping, so I wouldn't necessarily treat it as a universal model for discovery or human behavior. But it is useful here because it points to a broader pattern. When users face complex search and evaluation tasks, information overload becomes a significant factor in decision making, and people may become more willing to rely on algorithmic evaluation as task difficulty increases. Not surprising, when the work gets harder, a tool that promises to reduce the work becomes much more attractive. And that same study used the elaboration likelihood model, which is distinguishing between central cues that require a more careful evaluation and peripheral cues that require less cognitive effort. In overload conditions, people may rely more on the simpler cues when making judgments. The authors of that study discuss how anthropomorphic features such as warmth and empathy and perceived competence can influence user confidence and willingness to adopt AI chatbot recommendations as that decision aid. Super useful, a little bit unsettling. I mean, we used to rely on librarians and editors and indexers and other human intermediaries for this part of the work. They brought professional norms with them. AI intermediaries bring a different set of incentives and failure modes and accountability gaps. Basically, the more human and helpful an AI intermediary feels, the easier it may be to confuse a reduced effort interaction with a reliable discovery process. An AI assistant can absolutely help summarize or translate or compare and brainstorm. It can also hallucinate and omit sources, flatten disagreement, present stale information with confidence, or hide the path between the source and the answer. A conversational interface can make discovery feel easier without making the result more trustworthy. Not saying that AI has no role in discovery, it almost certainly does, but if AI becomes an intermediary between people and information, then provenance, source quality, recency, ranking, and accountability matter even more. I mean, a confident answer is not the same as a findable source. A fluent summary is not the same as a trustworthy discovery mechanism. So I hope that was interesting to you because that's actually the foundation for the rest of the series, that discovery is more than the act of finding something. Discovery is the process by which people and systems determine what exists, where it lives, whether it's relevant, whether it's trustworthy, whether it's available to the requester, and whether it should be visible in the first place. And that definition is intentionally broader than search. Search is one discovery pattern, but so are directories and registries and federation metadata, wallet mediated matching, browser prompts, recommender systems, DNS lookups. Each pattern has different assumptions. Each creates different failure modes. Each shifts power in a different way, which is why the word discovery keeps resurfacing in digital identity and in technology. It's an architecture problem, it's a trust problem, it's a user experience problem, and it's a governance problem. And because the universe has a sense of humor, it's often all of those problems at the same time. When someone says we need discovery, the first response should not be, well, what technology should we use? The first response should be, well, what kind of discovery do we mean? Are we trying to find public information? Or maybe a private account? A login path, a credential, a claim, a wallet, an agent, a source of truth, a thing we just forgot? These are very different problems. Treating them as one problem leads to bad design, and it also leads to a very familiar industry reflex, taking infrastructure that already exists and asking it to carry more meaning than it was designed to hold. And we're going to get to that because, yeah, this is where I hear a lot. Couldn't we just use DNS? It's amazing how often DNS comes up when you're talking about discovery. I understand the appeal. DNS is ubiquitous, it's delegated, it's operationally familiar, and it's already part of the internet's nervous ecosystem. Look, you don't have to rebuild something. Here's something that does discovery in a fabulous distributed way. Yes, it's already doing quite a lot, and it's using that as the default answer to every discovery problem, risks overloading a system that, while robust in some ways, is very, very fragile in others. But before we continue arguing about infrastructure, we need to understand the problem space. And that starts with identity discovery, because once a thing being discovered is tied to identity, the question is no longer, can I find it? It is the who's allowed to find it, under what authority, what proof, and with what consequences. And that's what the next post is going to be about. Thanks for listening. I hope you stay tuned for the next week's post. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.